What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for week 8 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out if you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday night football, we've got the Ravens at the Buccaneers. Man, I'm sitting the Ravens wide receivers. I don't think they should be considered anything more than a flex going into the short week. Rashad Bateman had just 8.2 fantasy points in week 7, 42 receiving yards off of 4 receptions. Devin Duvernay, on the other hand, had just 6.2 fantasy points, 2 receptions, and 42 receiving yards. I just don't feel great about this Ravens passing attack at the moment. I don't see very high ceilings for either Bateman or Duvernay going in to the week. On the other hand, the Buccaneers wide receivers, while this offense has been struggling overall, the two primary receivers have been playing very good football. Mike Evans had 18.6 fantasy points in week 7, 9 receptions off of 15 targets, 96 receiving yards. Could have had an even better fantasy stat line if he didn't drop a giant touchdown pass in the first half of the game, but regardless, still finishes with a very nice stat line. Chris Godwin, on the other hand, 11.5 points in full PPR, 7 receptions off of 13 targets, and 43 receiving yards. So a very nice stat line in full PPR for Godwin as well. When it comes to any other of the receivers on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, they're just far too inconsistent. We don't know if half of them are going to play. I don't want to consider starting any of the other players, whether it's Russell Gage or Julio Jones, who we haven't seen play in a few weeks. Whoever it is, no need to mention them. Evans and Godwin are the primary receivers. Majority of you guys are going to be considering starting. And for me, even on a short week on Thursday Night Football, I'm still starting Evans and Godwin as we approach week 8. All right, Broncos at Jaguars. Really encouraged you guys last week to sit Courtland Sutton as he squared off against Sauce Gardner. And man, Gardner had the better day of the two. Sutton finished with just 5.3 fantasy points, 9 targets, 3 receptions, 23 receiving yards. And he did have just 3.4 fantasy points in week 6. I still think if you're desperate enough, you can consider Sutton as a flex option and full PPR. I still think he's the strongest flex option on this team in terms of consistency. Weeks 1 through 5, he had double-digit fantasy points in every game, so I do think Sutton can get back to what we saw him doing in the earlier part of the season. Jerry Jeudy had a nice week 7, 16.6 fantasy points, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards. He was the better receiver, obviously, on the day in week 7, so I do think you can consider flexing Jerry Jeudy once again if you're absolutely desperate enough, but I would do so with a lot of hesitation because I'm just not confident. When we look at Jerry Jeudy, he's been very up and down on the season. 3 games with double-digit fantasy performances and 4 games with single-digit fantasy performances. We're not quite sure at this point in time who the starting quarterback is going to be in this matchup, so I'm not really confident in either of the receivers. But if you have to start a Broncos receiver, it should be in your flex, and it should only be in full PPR scoring formats. All right, when we look at Christian Kirk for the Jacksonville Jaguars, encourage you guys to continue to keep him in your flex last week, and he definitely came through for those of you who did start him last week. 17.1 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 96 receiving yards. He comes in as your wide receiver 10 in full PPR at the moment, but he's definitely downgraded to a flex this week as he will square off against Pat Surtain, who is a phenomenal young corner in the NFL. So I would start Christian Kirk in the flex if you have to, but once again, similar to the Broncos receiver, do so with a lot of hesitation and probably some concern. Kirk is definitely not my favorite flex as we move into week 8. All right, Dolphins at Lions. You're starting Tyreek Hill. He comes in as your wide receiver 3 in full PPR, 13 targets, 7 receptions, 72 receiving yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers in week 7. We can move right along. Hill is in your starting lineups. This is a really good matchup for these Dolphins. Starters, Jalen Waddle, on the other hand, comes in as your wide receiver 7 in full PPR. And yes, he is a must start as well. 12.8 fantasy points for Waddle in week 7. Just 5 targets, 4 receptions on the night for Waddle. 88 receiving yards. Still a very good fantasy stat line. Like I said, this is a really good overall game script for the Miami Dolphins offense from a fantasy perspective, going up against an absolutely abysmal Detroit Lions defense. Speaking of the Detroit Lions, I'm going to sit back and watch and monitor the health of the Lions receivers this week leading up to this matchup. Brighton Monroe St. Brown luckily avoided a concussion in week 7, but did have to exit week 7's matchup against the Dallas Cowboys. So it looks like he's got a chance to play against the Dolphins in week 8. I'm still a little bit hesitant. I think Monroe St. Brown comes in as a flex. I'm just worried about the overall health of this Lions team at the moment. I think that this Dolphins defense has an opportunity to play pretty well on Sunday, but Josh Reynolds could be a play if Monroe St. Brown is out. It really depends on who is healthy and who's not healthy before he can make any definite decisions moving into the week. So let's just sit back and see what happens throughout the week, and we'll answer those questions as they come up and when we know who is going to be healthy and who's not going to be healthy for the Detroit Lions receiving corps as we approach week 8. All right, Panthers at Falcons. Man, I was not comfortable starting DJ Moore in week 7, but we had some debate throughout the week, right? Could DJ Moore be better with Christian McCaffrey not on this team? But I just wasn't certain. I just told you guys, let's sit back, let's sit DJ Moore for the week and see what happens. Well, if you didn't listen to me and you threw him in your flex or in as your wide receiver 2 on the week, you did pretty good. He had 19.6 fantasy points, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 69 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So yes, going up against the Atlanta Falcons, who Tyler Boyd and Jamar Chase just absolutely burnt last week. A little bit of T. Higgins in there as well, and even some Hayden Hurst. This is a defense we want to exploit overall through the passing game. So yes, believe it or not, PJ Walker at quarterback, no Christian McCaffrey, an interim head coach, whatever you want to say about the Panthers, I still think we can flex DJ Moore as we move into week 8. All right, Drake London, on the other hand, is a sit for me. JC Horn's playing pretty good football at the cornerback position, and really outside of that, you know, being a tough matchup for the young receiver, he really has not played well from a fantasy perspective over the last 4 weeks. And those first 3 weeks of the season were so promising, with at least 12 points in his first 3 starts and a ceiling of 24.6 points. Since week 3, he has had 7.5 or less fantasy points. He had his worst performance of the year in week 7 at 1.9 points. Just 1 target in this game for Drake London, 1 reception. A really bad day overall from a fantasy perspective. So going into week 8, I have no confidence in starting Drake London. All right, Cardinals at Vikings. We really encourage you guys to start DeAndre Hopkins last week. You know, fire him right out the gate. He wasn't coming back from injuries, coming back from a suspension, and man, did he have a night. 14 targets, 10 receptions, 103 receiving yards on Thursday Night Football, 20.3 fantasy points. I like this matchup this week against the Vikings. I like this game script as a whole. We are starting DeAndre Hopkins again, and for me at the moment, this is the receiver to start for the Cardinals. I'm not confident enough to start Rondale Moore after a poor performance, and I mean, definitely keep an eye on Rondale Moore, but I mean, you tell me, I don't have the confidence to start him, right? Greg Dortch came back out of nowhere with a touchdown grab on Thursday Night Football, but overall, you know, while we want to keep an eye on those two, I guess, and also Robbie Anderson, you know, who just had 1 target in his first appearance with the Cardinals. It's Hopkins for me. Everyone else is way too risky. Okay, talking about a receiver who's not risky at all, you're starting Justin Jefferson in this matchup. Don't care who JJ's going up against. He's your wide receiver 5 in fantasy. Obviously on bye week in week 7, but I do think that we can roll with Justin Jefferson. I think that Adam Thielen is always a flex option. You know, the ceiling's not great at 18 points on the season. The floors aren't great as well. but he's going to get you somewhere between 6 and 15 fantasy points, 7 and 18 fantasy points, however you want to look at it. The Cardinals have played pretty well on the season against opposing receivers, but I like this game script overall. I think that THIELEN is definitely a player you can consider in the flex as we move on to week 8. All right, Bears at Cowboys. At the moment, I'm sitting Darnell Mooney, and while I'm recording this, he's playing pretty well overall against the New England Patriots. At the moment, he has 6 targets, 3 receptions, and 53 receiving yards, but I just don't like this matchup for Mooney. Really don't like it for the Bears. This Cowboys defense is for real, man, and don't get me wrong, the Bears look okay against the New England Patriots right now. But unless you're in a desperate position for a flex player in a full PPR league, you really don't need to consider Darnell Mooney. He hasn't had more than 13.8 fantasy points on the season, and that is in the PPR scoring format. So Mooney, for a majority of you guys, I think is a sit as we approach the week, unless you're absolutely desperate. All right, CeeDee Lamb, on the other hand, is going to be a start for me on a weekly basis. He's had double-digit performances every game this year except for week 1, and I get that he's been playing closer to his floor as opposed to his ceiling of 22 points so far on the year, but I just like him in this matchup. I think the game plan will be a little bit better in terms of throwing the football this week, where last week I think it was pretty obvious they were going to be able to run the football against the Lions and just play really solid defense. So I do think that the Cowboys have a better game script on hand here in week 8. I do think that CeeDee Lamb could have a better game overall. All right, we want to keep an eye on Michael Gallup, who gave us a goose egg in week 7. I mean, I really was surprised. I thought that him and Dak would get it going right out of the gate. They've had a good chemistry historically, but we did not see it. So continue to monitor Michael Gallup, and even Noah Brown for that matter, who had a decent day. 7 targets, 5 receptions, 50 receiving yards against Detroit in week 7. But until we get a more concrete, consistent sample size out of those receivers, we don't want to consider starting them moving into week 8. All right, Raiders at Saints. This is a really easy game for me to look at, right? We are starting Davante Adams, no doubt about it. He's your wide receiver 6 in full PPR, 17.5 fantasy points in week 7, 8 receptions, 95 receiving yards. He now has double-digit fantasy points in every game this year except for week 2 against Arizona, and he still scored a touchdown in that game. So we are firing him up against the New Orleans Saints without a doubt. I'm not confident enough to start Hunter Renfrow, who had his second best performance of the season at 8.5 fantasy points against the Houston Texans. 3 targets, 3 receptions, 55 receiving yards. I mean, Renfrow to me has just been absolutely disappointing. Mac Hollins did have a score in 12.4 fantasy points in week 7, but he had a goose egg in week 5 and just 6.3 points in week 4. So I'm still not confident to even flex Mac Hollins of the Raiders. I guess we could keep an eye on him after he scored here, but I just think he's far too inconsistent to consider a start. All right, Chris Olave has been an absolute monster this year. Didn't play in week 6, had 9.1 points in week 1, but outside of that, he has had 10 or more fantasy points in every game this year. 17.6 points against the Arizona Cardinals, 14 targets, 7 receptions, 106 receiving yards. We are starting Olave, especially in full PPR formats, on a weekly basis. Keep an eye on Michael Thomas's health throughout the week. I don't know if we're ever going to see him play football again, but at the moment, you know, he's still dealing with a foot injury. If he's good to go, we could consider him in the flex because the Raiders secondary hasn't played great on the year, but at the moment he's not healthy. At the moment, Jarvis Landry isn't healthy. Callaway is a player we could look at, I guess, but he only had 2 receptions in week 7. And then we could also take a look at Traquan Smith, but he just had 5 receptions, 59 receiving yards in week 7. He was the better between him and Callaway in week 7, 10.9 fantasy points. But all of this is dependent on Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry's health. So then the day, start Chris Olave as we move into week 8 for the New Orleans Saints. All right, Steelers at Eagles. Man, I'm flexing George Pickens if I have to start a Steelers receiver going into a matchup that I think is going to be really tough for the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. Pickens had 18.1 fantasy points in week 7, 6 targets, 6 receptions, 61 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Him and Kenny Pickett just have that chemistry. When Pickett is in trouble, or if he wants to make a big play, he's looking in the direction of George Pickens. And man, we've seen flashes of this throughout the preseason and throughout the regular season. Pickens can play some football. Listen, I'm still, a fan of Diontae Johnson, but from a fantasy perspective, we're just getting too low of floors lately. I really wish we could get him back to those ceilings in full PPR that we were seeing at the beginning of the season, between 11.5 and 16.4 fantasy points in those first 3 games of the year. But overall, this offense is just capping players like Diontae Johnson's upside, so he's going to be a sit for me in a tough matchup against the Eagles. Chase Claypool, on the other hand, had 9.1 fantasy points in week 7. He continues to be a sit for me as well, because once again, we're seeing too much of the floors and not enough of the ceilings for Claypool, who did have 23.4 points in week 6, but just 9.1 in week 7, like I said. So I'm going to sit Claypool and Johnson unless you're absolutely desperate for a flex play, but I just really don't like it going up against this Philadelphia Eagles defense. Pickens is the only player I would take a chance on. AJ Brown is your wide receiver 18 in full PPR scoring formats at this point in the season. Double-digit performances every week of the year except for week 5 for AJ Brown. This offense is humming. This Steelers secondary is not playing good football. We're starting AJ Brown on a weekly basis, no doubt about it. And DeVonta Smith is a weekly flex play for me because his offense is phenomenal. DeVonta Smith is a boomer bust type of player who brings a lot of upside, a ceiling of 30.9 points so far on the season. I believe that we continue to start Smith in the flex on a weekly basis, and this matchup against the Steelers is absolutely phenomenal. All right, Patriots at Jets. I think we can continue to flex JAKOBI Meyers. At the time I'm recording this, he has just 1 target, 1 reception, 30 receiving yards against the Chicago Bears, but guess what? That reception went for a touchdown. So that gives JAKOBI Meyers in full PPR double-digit performances in every game he's played in this year. He missed weeks 3 and 4. So listen, the ceiling is pretty risky with Meyers, although he did hit 24.1 points in week 5 against the Detroit Lions. But overall, I do think he is a safe flex play in full PPR scoring format, so I'll continue to flex Meyers on a weekly basis. On the other hand, I will continue to sit the Jets receivers. I just haven't seen enough consistency out of these players. Corey Davis had just 1 target in week 7, 0 receiving yards. Garrett Wilson had 5 targets, 4 receptions, 24 receiving yards overall. There's just nothing to really see here. Elijah Moore didn't even play in week 7. We don't really know the future of Elijah Moore with the Jets, although they have said they're not expecting to trade him. It's a tough matchup against the New England Patriots, who aren't playing great at the moment against the Chicago Bears while I'm recording this. But even with that being said, I just don't have the confidence in the Jets receivers whatsoever as we move into week 8. All right, Titans at Texans. This is easily the ugliest game of the week at the wide receiver position. Listen, for the Texans receivers, it's a pretty good matchup going up against the Houston Texans. And for the Titans receivers, I just don't know what we're supposed to do with this bunch. And really, overall, I just have no confidence in either receiving room. When we look at the Titans receivers, Robert Woods is your wide receiver 64 in fantasy at 5.6 points against the Colts in week 7. We really haven't seen anyone else step up at the wide receiver position for the Tennessee Titans, so I am just going to say they are all sits going up against the Texans in week 8. When we look at the Texans receiving core, I mean, you would hope someone is going to step up at some point on the season for this team, and it's a good matchup against the Titans secondary, but I don't have the confidence to start Nico Collins or Brandon Cooks. Cooks had 8.6 points in week 7. Nico Collins had 6.3 in week 7. I just have no confidence in either of these receiving rooms moving into week 8. They're all going to be sits for me. All right, Giants at Seahawks. I like this game script overall for both of these teams and their respective receivers. Randall Robinson looks to be the wide receiver to start for the New York Giants. 11 points in week 7 after having 12.7 in week 6. So 8 targets, 6 receptions, 50 receiving yards in week 7 for Robinson. I think in full PPR scoring formats, you can continue to start him if you're a little bit less confident, or, actually it's probably just safer to put him in the flex. But in terms of the Giants receivers, he is the receiver to start at the moment. We want to keep an eye on Darius Slayton, who's been a little bit inconsistent, but as Daniel Jones continues to gain confidence, we really do want to watch both these Giants receivers in Robinson and Slayton. Slayton had 14.8 fantasy points in week 7, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 58 receiving yards, and a score. Just 2.8 points in week 6, but 13.9 in week 5. So we definitely want to keep an eye on Darius Slayton as we continue to move into week 8. All right, let's talk about the Seahawks receivers. Right, at the moment I'm recording this, we know that DK Metcalf has a knee injury. He has supposedly avoided anything serious, though, and according to Pete Carroll, he has a chance to play in week 8 against the Giants. If Metcalf is healthy, he's probably downgraded to a flex for me just because of the risk of injury, right? But I still believe in DK Metcalf without a doubt. Like I said, I like the overall game script here for the Giants and Seahawks. We really are just going to have to wait to see the health of DK Metcalf, right? Tyler Lockett is just going to be a start regardless of if Metcalf is healthy or not, right? He gets a little bit of a boost if Metcalf does not play. If Metcalf plays, it doesn't really affect it doesn't really affect Lockett's output. Lockett had 11.5 fantasy points in week 7, 7 receptions, 45 receiving yards off of 8 targets. So we just continue to start Lockett, who only has 2 starts this year without double-digit fantasy performances. So on top of that, right, we got to talk about Marquise Goodwin, who's been a hot name on the waiver wire going into the week. I think we sit back and watch him as we approach the week. He could be a solid flex play after having 22.7 fantasy points in week 7 and 2 touchdowns, but I'm not confident in starting him in the flex if Metcalf plays. So there's a lot to look at here, and really what it comes down to is DK Metcalf going to play in week 8 or not? All right, Commanders at Colts. I would continue to flex Terry McLaurin. He looked good with his old pal Taylor Heineke throwing the football, and Heineke should suit up against the Colts again in week 8. 18.3 fantasy points for McLaurin against the Packers in week 7. 8 targets, 5 receptions, 73 receiving yards, and we finally got a touchdown on McLaurin, the first time we've seen that since week 1 of the season. I was really happy to see McLaurin have a good day. All right, Curtis Samuel's been so back and forth, guys, right? After coming out of the season really strong at 18.2 points and 22.9, he had 13.1 in week 3, 7.8 in week 4, 12.2 in week 5, and then just 2.6 in week 6, but then 12.9 in week 7. He's just been very back and forth. He is a player I would consider watching unless you're absolutely desperate. You could put him in the flex, but for me, Curtis Samuel just brings a lot of boom or bust, right? He had a good productive day with Heineke at quarterback. If that continues in week 8, we'll have a different discussion, but for me, I'm going to sit back and watch Samuel against the Colts. I'm not confident enough in starting him because he's been so all over the place, but if you're absolutely desperate, you could consider him a flex. All right, the Colts receivers absolutely, and I mean absolutely, disappointed me in week 7 against a really bad Tennessee Titans secondary. And really, for me, you know, I was looking at Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce going into the week. Paris Campbell did have a good day, but Pittman, 9.8 fantasy points, 6 receptions, 58 receiving yards as a whole. Alec Pierce, who I thought was going to have a really nice day, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 37 receiving yards. This really worried me, man, because listen, the Commanders have a bad secondary, but if the Colts couldn't get it done against the Tennessee Titans, and now we got Matt Ryan sitting in this game, we got Sam Ehlinger, who's going to start supposedly for the rest of the season. I just don't know what to expect out of this Colts offense, but Paris Campbell looked good last week. Will he have that same chemistry with Ehlinger? I don't know. Can we consider flexing these receivers because the Commander secondary is that bad? Yes, but that's about it for me as we move into week 8. All right, Niners at Rams. We're starting Deebo Samuel. He is questionable day-to-day with a hamstring injury, but if Deebo lines up, right, we're starting him. His first non-double-digit fantasy performance was week 7 against Kansas City Chiefs. 9.4 fantasy points, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 42 receiving yards. But outside of week 7, he's giving you double-digit performances in full PPR every week of the season. We know the ceiling that Deebo can bring. 23.7 so far on the season. Hopefully we can see some better output out of Deebo in terms of those ceilings, but we just have to start him on a weekly basis. Okay, Brandon Ayuk is a flex maybe from here on out for me, and he's a flex in week 8 against the Rams. Guys, the Rams have not played great against opposing wide receivers whatsoever this season outside of Jalen Ramsey. So whether Samuel is healthy or not, I think we roll with Brandon Ayuk as a whole. Ayuk had 15.2 fantasy points in week 7, 11 targets, 7 receptions, 82 receiving yards after having 28.3 fantasy points in week 6. So I will continue to roll with Ayuk, especially as a flex option moving into week 8 and this nice little divisional matchup. All right, Cooper Kupp was on bye week in week 7. He's still your wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. You're still starting Cooper Kupp on a weekly basis. His season low is 16.4 fantasy points. He also had 16.7 points in week 6. Outside of those two performances, he has 25.9 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 31.8 in week 1 against Buffalo in full PPR scoring formats. We are not even coming close to considering sitting Cooper Kupp. He is a weekly must start no matter the matchup, no matter what happens. Cooper Kupp is in your starting lineups if you own him moving into week 8. All right, Packers at Bills. Man, this Packers offense needs a strong performance. Listen, I told you guys, right, Allen Lazard last week was a must-start player for me. Allen Lazard is a weekly play for me. Since week 2 of the season, he's either given you a touchdown or double-digit fantasy performances every week of the season. A disappointing day in my perspective going up against Washington in week 7 with just 11.5 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 55 receiving yards, but he is still the most reliable and consistent receiver on the Packers. It is worth noting he's dealing with a shoulder injury, but if he's good to go, we start Allen Lazard on a weekly basis, and I am sitting the rest of the Packers receivers because I just don't trust this offense right now outside of Allen Lazard and Aaron Jones as we approach week 8. All right, Stephon Diggs, on the other hand, for the Buffalo Bills, was on bye week in week 7, and he's still your wide receiver 1 in fantasy. 10.2 points in week 4, 14.4 in week 3. Outside of that, he's given you 24.2 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 44.8 points in week 2. No discussion to be had here. We are starting Diggs on a weekly basis. I would sit Isaiah McKenzie. He's been far too inconsistent as a side note, but Gabe Davis has really come to light in his last 2 starts at 32.1 points in week 5, 16.4 in week 6. On the bye week in week 7, we're starting Gabe Davis in week 8, and I hope he's a flex option for you. I like him the most in the flex, but if you can start him as a wide receiver 2, I don't mind it. He's on the best offense arguably in the entire league. Davis can be considered a start as we move into week 8. All right, Bengals at Browns, Monday Night Football. Jamar Chase is a madman. I begged you guys a few weeks ago, please try and trade for Jamar Chase while you can, while everyone is saying T. Higgins is the guy for the Bengals. I'm not discrediting T. Higgins whatsoever. Well, Chase was bringing you, closer to the floor overall, between 10 and 12 fantasy points. I begged you guys, please try and trade for him. If you have an owner chasing your league who does not believe in Chase, please get him 32 or more fantasy points in his last 2 performances, 33 points, his season high in week 7, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 130 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. He now has 130 or more receiving yards in his 2 games and 2 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He is playing out of his mind. That chemistry between him and Burrow, I begged you guys to understand that it was not going anywhere. Do I expect him to score 32 points this week? No, not necessarily, but Jamar Chase is still a weekly start. He is your wide receiver 4 in full PPR scoring formats. He's your wide receiver 2 in standard scoring formats. All right, T. Higgins is a weekly start for me, even if he isn't the player bringing the highest ceiling at the wide receiver position for the Bengals. He's still a phenomenal, consistent wide receiver when he's not dealing with an ankle injury in fantasy football. 14.3 points in week 7, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 93 receiving yards for Higgins in week 7. He continues to be a weekly play. A little bit of boomer bust potential to Higgins, but I would say most of the time he's going to bring you a really safe floor if he does not boom for you. The player who brings more of a boomer bust potential is probably Tyler Boyd, who had a huge day, his best fantasy performance of the year in week 7, 29.5 points against Atlanta, 9 targets, 8 receptions, 155 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So I think that you can flex Tyler Boyd going up against the Browns, but he gets an asterisk because you want to do so with a little bit of caution because you never know what you're going to get out of Tyler Boyd. But he has at least 12 points in his last 2 matchups in full PPR scoring formats, and he's coming off his best game of the season. So I do think that he's perfectly fine to flex in week 8 if you don't have better options. All right, going into week 7, I told you guys that Amari Cooper is just a weekly play for me, man. Wide receiver 11 at the moment in fantasy football and full PPR, and I think he's doing so very quietly. Listen, not crazy ceilings as of late. His last 2 performances, 14 or less fantasy points, just 10 points in week 7 against Baltimore, but still a good enough stat line to get you through, right? 4 targets, 3 receptions, 74 receiving yards. We like to get him, you know, closer to those ceilings we were seeing earlier in the year between 20 and 25 fantasy points. But overall, Cooper's your wide receiver 11, full PPR. You're going to continue to start him even in standard. He's your wide receiver 13. So Amari Cooper is in your starting lineup on a weekly basis in my mind. Donovan Peoples-Jones has really shown some consistency over the last 4 weeks. Week 4, 12.1 points. Week 5, 9 points. Week 6, 11.6 points. Week 7, 11.1 points. We continue to consider DPJ in the flex. He's rostered 35% of fantasy leagues at the moment. I do think he's a solid waiver wire pickup moving into week 8. Listen, is he going to bring you some boomer bust? Yeah, absolutely. But at the end of the day, he's shown consistency in the last couple weeks, like I said. So if you're desperate, I do think that DPJ is a player we can consider moving into week 8. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.